Good afternoon, good evening, as the case may be. I'm Stephen Pfeiffer. I'm a William Perry Research Fellow at Stanford Center for International Security and Cooperation. Over the last several weeks, we've talked about American and German perspectives on the Russian challenge to the West. And today we're going to hear a perspective from London. I would say that over the last decade, as relations between the West and Russia have deteriorated, there's been a very clear view in the British government about the nature of the Russian challenge. And both within NATO and in the European Union, the British government has been a strong advocate for pushing back against Russian egregious misbehavior. And I'd say that one of the several things to regret about Brexit is we're no longer going to have that British voice at the center of EU policymaking when it comes to questions like Russia. As regards Britain's bilateral relations with Russia, they've been difficult, as have America's. You've seen cyber attacks, domestic interference, and assassinations or assassination attempts of former Russian intelligence officers in Britain, and that's made for a more complex relationship. So I'm pleased today that we have Ambassador Ian Bond to discuss how London views the Russian challenge and the Western policy response. Ambassador Bond is Director of Foreign Policy at the Center for European Reform in London. He joined the center in 2013 after 28 years with the British Diplomatic Service. That included as the British ambassador to Latvia, but he also was posted to Moscow, the British mission to NATO, the British mission to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and to Washington. And he holds the CVO, that's the Commander of the Royal Victorian Order, something that British diplomats get that American diplomats invariably envy. But we're very glad that he could join us. He'll offer about 15 minutes of opening comments, and then we'll open up the floor to questions. Please use the Q&A function to post your questions, and I will try to get to as many as possible. Ian, thanks very much for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Steve. And I mean, it's funny you should mention the CVO as something that you envy. I always liked those letters from the Secretary of State that you guys got telling you you'd done a good job. It was something that you never really got from the Foreign Secretary. Anyway, there we are.
Something from the Queen.
No, that's true. That's true. So, I mean, first of all, let me say what an enormous pleasure it is for me to be talking to Stanford, if not being in Stanford. One of my great pleasures when I was posted in Washington was to make a trip about once a year to take the temperature on the West Coast and to visit some of the sort of experts on foreign policy issues in academic institutions over there. And being able to dip into the deep reservoirs of knowledge at Stanford was always a huge pleasure. It's slightly daunting for me to follow Fiona Hill and Thomas Bagger in this series of talks because both of them have much more contemporary frontline experience of dealing with the Russians than I do. But in any case, I think, I've been following the Russian dossier for a long time, and I think I have a reasonable appreciation of what's going on in the UK-Russia relationship. So what I'll try to do today is to characterize that relationship a bit, to say something about how I see Russia's situation and trajectory and how that's connected with the way that it deals with the UK. And then finally to say a bit about what I think the UK is getting right and wrong in its policy towards Russia. And some of this may feel distressingly familiar to a US audience as well. I mean, I could start by saying that the UK's relationship with Russia is quite bad. And I would certainly have plenty of evidence for that. Steve, you mentioned the attempted assassinations in the UK. We had the successful assassination of Alexander Litvinenko using polonium in London in 2006. Then the attack on Sergei Skripal in Salisbury in 2018 using a nerve agent, which incidentally killed a completely innocent British citizen who just happened to pick up the wrong thing. We've had hacking attacks on British universities and medical research establishments during the pandemic. And we've had the more traditional Russian probing of our air defenses and so on, and submarine incursions and the like. And the British have had sanctions on Russia since 2014 and the annexation of Crimea. And recently, we've had the introduction of Magnitsky legislation to enable the imposition of targeted sanctions on Russian officials involved in human rights abuses. But to concentrate on the bad relations wouldn't really tell you the whole story. And perhaps I can illustrate this with an example. So, as of last week, one of the newest members of the House of Lords, the upper house of Parliament, is Baron Yevgeny Lebedev. He was appointed to his seat by Boris Johnson. And the titles of members of the House of Lords associate them with a place, usually a place where they live or where they spent their formative years. And the former Mr. Yevgeny Lebedev is now Baron Lebedev of Hampton, which is a suburb of London where I presume he has a house, and of Siberia in the Russian Federation. And who is Baron Lebedev? Well, he's the owner of the main London evening newspaper, the Evening Standard. He's also the owner of a villa in Italy where Boris Johnson attended a wild party while he was foreign secretary and was later photographed looking very much the worse for wear at a nearby airport, having somewhere along the line dropped his bodyguards. And Mr. Lebedev, or Baron Lebedev, I suppose I should call him now, is also the son of a KGB officer who served in London. So, not for nothing is London sometimes called Londongrad. After the breakup of the Soviet Union, it became one of the destinations of choice for wealthy Russians and other members of the former Soviet elite. They buy the most expensive houses in London, they send their children to the best boarding schools, they own football clubs, and as in the case of Lebedev, newspapers. And once they become British citizens and the red carpet is rolled out for those who bring enough money to the party, they contribute very considerable sums to political parties and above all to the Conservative Party. Lyubov Chernukhina, who is the wife of a former Russian deputy finance minister, has given £1.7 million, or about $2.25 million, to the Conservatives in recent years, including £135,000 for a dinner with the then Prime Minister Theresa May and prominent female Conservative MPs. So British policy towards Russia has a sort of split personality. On the one hand, there's a hard-nosed element. A lot of Russia watchers, both in government and out of it, who see Russia both as a declining power, but also as a disruptive and destabilizing country, and who are willing to see the UK invest in the necessary capabilities to counter Russia. And then on the other hand, there's a group which combines this wealthy Russian diaspora, a group of Britons who are quite happy to take Russian money, either personally or in terms of investment in the UK, without asking too many questions about the strings attached to it. And perhaps also some who feel ideologically closer to Putin's social conservatism than to squishy European liberalism. And it's not a party political issue. This is quite interesting in a way. I mean, in the Cold War, you tended to find the people who were aligned with the Soviet Union on the wilder fringes of the Labour Party. But Oleg Deripaska, who I think still can't get a visa to visit the US, hosted both the conservative George Osborne before he became Chancellor of the Exchequer and Labour's then Secretary of State for Business aboard his yacht in the Mediterranean in the 2000s. And you can see also in the Cross-Party Intelligence and Security Committee report on Russia that was published in July this year, that attitudes to Russia vary within parties at least as much as between them. Boris Johnson didn't want the report published at all. Julian Lewis, who now chairs the Intelligence and Security Committee, was a Conservative MP who was expelled from the party because he stood against and beat Johnson's preferred candidate to become the chair of the committee, whose job, it was quite clear, had he been elected, was to ensure that the report on Russia was never published. And one of the main speakers at the report's launch was Stuart MacDonald, who's a Scottish National Party MP who takes a very strong line on countering Russian interference, even as his former party leader, Alex Salmond, fronted a show on the Russian propaganda station RT. The split even runs through the existing government. So Dominic Raab, before he became Foreign Secretary, was one of the main parliamentary supporters of British Magnitsky legislation. While Boris Johnson's campaign to become leader was backed financially by Alexander Temerko, who's now a British citizen and an energy entrepreneur, but who was formerly an executive in the Russian defense industry and somebody who was believed to have ties to the Russian intelligence services. Now, I can't be a particularly objective commentator on this. I'm very much in the hard-nosed group, and the behavior of the second group makes me quite angry. Putin has been in power long enough and has done enough that no one should have any illusions about who he is. And politicians should not get themselves into a position where they are under any kind of obligation to Russian interests. But we are where we are. So what do I think Russia is up to in its relations with the UK? Well, I'm not sure that he should have said it out loud, but I have a lot of sympathy for President Obama's point of view when he said in 2014 that Russia was a regional power that threatened some of its neighbors not out of strength, but out of weakness. The Russian economy has been relatively stagnant since about 2012. Demographically, it's been in a pretty terrible state since the 1980s, certainly since the collapse of the Soviet Union. The working age population has fallen. The population in rural areas has fallen quite dramatically. There hasn't been a single year since the collapse of the Soviet Union when the birth rate in rural areas of Russia was higher than the death rate. Putin has invested a lot in modernizing the Russian military, but even defense spending is now in decline as a result of the economic situation, despite the sort of showy announcements of new terror weapons like nuclear-powered cruise missiles. So in circumstances where Russia is relatively weak, Putin has taken a logical approach. If you can't make your own country stronger, then make your opponents weaker. And he has quite successfully exploited the gaps, the splits, the polarization that exists in our own societies. He doesn't create them, but he identifies them and he uses them. And the UK has offered him some juicy prizes in recent years, both with the Scottish independence referendum and then in 2016 with the referendum on leaving the EU. Both RT and Sputnik were always very happy to give a platform to those who were in favor of the breakup of first the UK and then the EU. And I think that picking off the UK has three benefits for Putin. First, it weakens one of the two major European military powers along with France. If you look at the impact of Brexit, first of all, it's doing economic damage, which will feed through into our ability to support such a large defense budget, but it's also putting the unity of the United Kingdom under renewed strain. Secondly, Brexit weakens the EU. I mean, it certainly hasn't paralyzed the Union, and it hasn't led to other countries feeling that they want to emulate the British example. But it has taken up time that the EU could have spent more productively, and it's weakened its foreign policy capabilities. The UK was very active in EU common foreign and security policy, and particularly it was very adept at designing sanctions, including the 2014 sanctions package against Russia. And third, Brexit deprives the US of an important means of influencing EU policy making through the medium of the UK. Having the UK at the table, I'm not suggesting that we were a sort of Trojan horse, but having the UK at the table um, helped to bring a well-informed perspective on Washington thinking into the EU. Now, it's possible for the US and the EU to find other ways to fill that gap. But I think it's undeniable that there were occasions when it was useful to the US to have a lobbyist, if I can put it that way, in EU foreign policy discussions. So, if I can describe the government and the bureaucracy of the UK as the British establishment, what has the British establishment got right and wrong in its response to Russia in recent years? Well, I mean, quite a lot of its foreign policy has been quite sensible. It's taken a firm but reasonable approach on sanctions. It hasn't overestimated its influence in this area. Even if the UK cut off all trade with Russia, it wouldn't make that much difference to Moscow's calculations. The UK only accounts for about 2.5% of Russia's goods trade, whereas Germany represents something close to 8%. But the UK still has scope to use well-targeted measures, particularly affecting Russian access to credit via the City of London. I might say as an aside that it was fascinating listening to Thomas Bagger at the previous talk saying that permanent confrontation with Russia was not a viable option for Germany, because I think given the disparity in the economic dependence, I think it probably is a viable option, if not a desirable one for the UK. And also, I think, unlike Thomas, I might have stressed rather more that the existence of cooperation or confrontation with Russia depends at least as much on Vladimir Putin as it does on anybody on the British side. I mean, I think another area of British well-calibrated policy was the reaction to the poisoning of the Skripals. It was a very successful diplomatic campaign to persuade allies and partners to expel Russian intelligence officers and to create a tougher operating environment for them. And I think it was particularly successful getting the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons involved and getting them to take some technical steps to outlaw the kinds of nerve agents, the Novichok class of nerve agents that had been used in the Skripal case. And the UK kept up its guard militarily and even plugged some of the gaps that had developed after the Cold War, in particular in procuring new maritime patrol aircraft to respond to the fact that there is once more a lot of Russian submarine and other activity in the North Atlantic. But I think it's also got at least three things quite badly wrong. I mean, the first, which I've alluded to, is that it's allowed Russian money to talk too loudly in London. The Intelligence and Security Committee report is redacted almost out of existence, but it still gets the point across that the UK has not paid enough attention to the sources of Russian money and the leverage that it might have in London. There's a significant group of lawyers, investment bankers, private wealth managers, real estate managers who have a financial stake in the relationship with Moscow not getting too bad. Second, it's been too tolerant of Russian influence in and around Parliament. There was a group called the Conservative Friends of Russia, which had some quite respectable members, but which turned out to be a Russian intelligence-led front organization. Now, you know, that was then wound up, but it sort of re-emerged in a different guise. And I just don't think that Parliament has and the government have done enough to sweep out the stables. Lord Barker, who was a member of the House of Commons, was then elevated to the House of Lords. He was an energy minister under David Cameron. He became a non-executive chairman of Oleg Deripaska's EN Plus in 2017. And despite criticism from some of his colleagues, he continued to sit in the House of Lords, so to be a legislator in the upper chamber, until 2019, when he took leave of absence to work for EN Plus full time. I doubt that he has severed all his contacts with his former colleagues. And so that it's not just about conservatives, a former Liberal Democrat MP for Portsmouth, a major naval base, had an affair with a parliamentary assistant who was then accused by the British security services of being a Russian agent. So I think there's a lot more that needs to be done to clean up Parliament. And third, and this is my final point, and I think it's the mistake in a way that underlies the other two, was that from the 1990s onwards, the UK embraced the corrupt, kleptocratic system that grew up in Russia. And it allowed its businesses, indeed, in some cases, it encouraged its businesses to benefit from the rents that system extracted from the long-suffering Russian people, while treating Russia itself as an adversary. Now, I know you can't entirely divorce the people from the government in Russia. Putin couldn't have stayed in power as long as he had, as long as he has, without having his finger on the pulse of Russian popular thinking as well. But I think the UK would have done much better to push back against the corruption of the Russian elite from an early stage, and to put more effort into cultivating a new generation of potential leaders and incentivizing reforms to promote democracy and the rule of law. It's something which I'm conscious from my time in Moscow in the mid-90s, that we did not sufficiently appreciate what our inattention to the rule of law was allowing to develop in Russia. It's not an exclusively British failure by any means, but it's certainly something where we played a significant part. And I'll wrap up there and let you cross-examine me, Steve, or as you wish.
Great. Well, Ian, thank you very much for those comments. I think that gives us a very full picture on how London looks at Russia. Let me ask this. I mean, you mentioned Brexit. Is there a channel? I mean, what kind of channels have been established so that Britain, although it's no longer in the European Union, does the British government still have a mechanism to affect EU thinking?
Well, interestingly, the British government has refused to discuss an institutional foreign policy relationship with the EU. So Theresa May was very keen on this. She wanted an institutional relationship. She probably wanted rather more of it than the EU thought was tolerable for a non-member. When Boris Johnson came in and when the negotiations with the EU on the future relationship started in earnest, the EU put forward a draft based on the discussions that had taken place with Theresa May for a very extensive set of subject areas and agreements allowing various kinds of cooperation, including on sanctions regimes. And the British side said, thanks, but no thanks. We're just not going to discuss that at all. So the only mechanism really that the government now has is through more informal channels, primarily through the EU 3 as was, the European 3, I suppose now. So that's the UK, France and Germany meeting informally. And they focused in the past on the Iran nuclear deal, but they have broadened their agenda. And then other informal groupings. So the UK has quite close contacts with the Nordic and Baltic countries, not least because of the British military presence as part of the NATO enhanced forward presence in Estonia. So we take some close interest in there. But what we don't have is the sort of structured relationship which the US and Canada, for example, have traditionally had with the EU, where you have regular engagements at political directors level and working group level with the EU as an institution.
Okay. The next question is, would you like to try comparing the British report on Russian interference in UK domestic politics? How did that compare to the Mueller report on what the Russians tried to do in the United States? Are there some similarities in their findings? Do they sort of identify a similar problem, or are there major differences?
Yeah, I mean, the reports are different in their conception in a way, because Mueller as a his job in a sense was to assemble a legal case, or to say whether there was a legal case there. And the Intelligence and Security Committee's basic function is to look at the British intelligence and security services and how they're carrying out their responsibilities. So quite a bit of the Intelligence and Security Committee's, as it were, the operational part of its report is identifying gaps in the system that we had, and the fact that the security service didn't perhaps stand up to Russian interference in our political process as much as it should, because it thought that was a political task, and the politicians, for whatever reason, didn't task the intelligence services with dealing with this issue. So there's a slightly different concept to the two reports. But in terms of the kind of factual underpinnings, I'd say there are some similarities in that they both exposed attempts to exploit weaknesses in our democratic systems in order to drive wedges and to exploit polarization in our societies.
Okay. All right, next question, which is, you've talked about the role of Russian money and its influence with some members of parliament. Do you see steps that might be taken to curb and reduce that influence? And I think in the same way that, maybe perhaps the United States needs to curb the impact of money that flows into real estate markets in Miami and New York, where we don't ever know where that money originates.
Yeah, I mean, I think, transparency, as so often, is the watchword. So the House of Commons is actually reasonably transparent about where MPs get their money from. They do have to declare their interests. You get a lot more latitude in the House of Lords, and I think that's an issue. You don't have to be as transparent as a member of the House of Lords. But also on the lobbying side, we don't have an equivalent of your Foreign Agent Registration Act. And that's something which has been talked about, and which I think the Intelligence and Security Committee was quite keen on. Now, it's obviously not a perfect solution. There are plenty of people who seem to operate as lobbyists on behalf of foreign powers in Washington without being registered as such. But it does give you a certain tool to be able to go after people if they're not declaring that they are working on behalf of a foreign government. And so I think that's, whether the current British government is interested in that or not is another question. But I think that's an area that we need to look at. The area that I think really deserves more scrutiny is this question of party funding. The Conservative Party is able to say, Lyubov Chernukhina is a British citizen. She's perfectly entitled to give money to the Conservative Party. And we have declared that she has given that money, so what's your problem? They're not obliged, and nobody else is obliged, to make any further inquiry into the sources of that money, or to say anything about the kinds of conversations that Mrs. Chernukhina or other former Russian citizens who now donate to the Conservative Party have with prominent conservatives, and what kind of influence they might be seeking. I assume that it is not a purely charitable donation when she paid £160,000 to play tennis with David Cameron.
Okay, well, let me follow that question up with another question I've just got here, which is, do you think that the Russian efforts to buy influence with Parliament, with the British government, can you look at those efforts and then point to specific British policies that might have changed as a result? For example, has British altered its approach to supporting Ukraine in light of its contact with Russia because of that?
On the whole, I would say not, actually. I mean, I think, as you indicated in your introduction, the British government has been one of the sort of the tougher ones in Europe, in the EU before, in that area. I'd say perhaps the one area where we could have done more, and it's difficult to disentangle our own self-interest from Russian interests, is not applying European anti-money laundering measures effectively to some of our own overseas territories. So, if you're looking at jurisdictions like the British Virgin Islands, to some extent the Channel Islands, we have allowed a lot of secrecy about the origins of Russian and other former Soviet funds flowing into those jurisdictions, even though they are technically British territories. They're governed under their own sets of rules, and the British government has been rather slow. I mean, it's happening, but only because there's been a lot of pressure from Parliament, not so much from the front benches, but from the back benches, i.e. from people outside government, on the British government to clean up some of what goes on in these overseas territories.
Okay. Well, let me take one more question on what goes on with the influence question, and I'll shift to some questions of more foreign policy. How much awareness do you think there's among the average British citizen about the extent to which Russia has influence in Parliament with Her Majesty's government? Is this widely known?
I mean, I think thanks to the Intelligence and Security Committee report, it's a lot more widely known than it was before. I mean, there have been some good books on all of this, and I mean, I think there is certainly for those of us who live in London, we do worry about the source of some of the funds that go into large properties in parts of London and so on. But I suspect, if you're somewhere in a northern city, this may feel rather remote from your concerns. I think for me, one of the interesting things is Scotland, because Russian organized crime has been able to exploit some features of Scottish company law in a way that I think has been really quite shocking. And I think that the Scottish government has not been quick enough to wake up to that and to do something about it.
Okay. All right. Well, let's go a little bit outside of London now.
Yes, please do.
Now, you described Russia as, I think correctly, as a country that it has many features of a country in decline. And I think one of those aspects would be an economy which still seems to be largely based in terms of its export structure on taking things out of the ground and selling them overseas, oil, gas, other minerals. So one question comes in here is that, do you think at some point, can we see a future point, and perhaps when in fact Russia's ability to exploit those natural resources, either because of depletion or perhaps because the world moves on to a less carbon dependent energy structure? Do you see that happening at some point? And how do you think then the Russian government would act as it saw this natural economic advantage depleting?
Yeah, I mean, we have a partial answer to the second part of that question, I think, already, in the sense that, if anything, Russia is doubling down. With the when Dmitry Medvedev was president, he did try to introduce a bit of diversification. I think, did he not come to Stanford? He certainly came to Silicon Valley, didn't he? And he went back. He set up Skolkovo as a kind of Russian Silicon Valley. Um, all of that's been dismantled, um, and there are actually people doing quite interesting things with IT and so on in Russia. Companies like Yandex are actually pretty good, um, but they're treated with quite a level of suspicion by the current authorities. Um, so I at the moment I don't see evidence of Putin looking to a low carbon future and thinking, gee, I ought to be plowing money into the next generation of Googles or even Alibabas or Tencents or whatever. Um, that's it's not really happening at the moment in Russia. And to the extent that he seems to have a strategy, it's been this. I mean, it's a trope to some extent. It goes back to at least Lenin, but it's the idea of Russia as a besieged fortress. So you kind of get people to tolerate the fact that the economy isn't doing that well by saying, we're surrounded by enemies and we've got to concentrate on the fight with our enemies. And I think, there's a sort of instrumentalization of the history of the Second World War to say to the current generation, your grandparents underwent these terrible hardships to make the Soviet Union great. You have much lesser hardships, but you must be worthy of your ancestors because we're still surrounded by enemies. And I mean, I would love to see more Russian investment in high-tech sectors and scientific research and so on. Talking to people in Russia who are in these areas, there's been a contraction in the amount that Russia is investing in the education sector, in research, which I think bodes quite ill for the future diversification of the Russian economy. And I mean, just one area where you would really think the Russians would have a comparative advantage is in the oil and gas sector, and yet there is very little innovation. You were the guys who commercialized fracking and other technologies, some of which were originally researched by Soviet engineers, but abandoned because they were just regarded as unnecessary.
It's interesting. I do remember when Medvedev came to Stanford in Silicon Valley, and there was a lot of fanfare about Silicon Valley, say 10 years ago. I'm not sure we hear much about it now, but I've always had the theory that Silicon Valley succeeds not just because you have lots of smart people, but there's a legal infrastructure that it makes it successful. There's a financial infrastructure, and I'm just not sure Russia's prepared to create those sorts of things that would enable Skolkovo to be a success. Which I guess gets to my question for you, and would be, there's this debate: is Putin a great tactician? Does he have a grand strategy? I mean, it seems to me that he's making choices that may strengthen Russia's position in the near term, but 10, 15 years down the road will lead to invariably a weaker Russia. How do you see Putin in terms of thinking about Russia's position in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I like to quote James Scher, now in Estonia, but once of Chatham House, who said Putin doesn't have a strategy, but he has a methodology. And I think, I talked about the disruption. I think he sees disruption as a way to keep resetting the table. Now, I still think that I would agree with you over the sort of 10 to 15 years, particularly if the majority of the world starts to decarbonize, Russia has some problems. Maybe Putin can adapt, maybe he can't, we'll see. But in the short term, he keeps the rest of us off balance quite effectively. And, maybe his way of looking at things is, well, you simply don't know what big events may be coming down the road in 10 or 15 years. We certainly haven't. If we had been holding this discussion exactly a year ago, we probably wouldn't have predicted that we would have spent most of the year hiding in our houses trying to avoid catching a dread disease. So, I think I would agree with James. I don't think Putin is a great strategist, but I think he has an idea of a general direction that he wants to move in, and he takes sort of steps that seem to him to be moving in that direction. Where I think he's, this in this term of office, where he's really struggled is to get his national programs moving, because actually he did set some quite sensible goals there, but obviously they've been completely knocked off course by the pandemic. Some of them were off course before that, but now I think completely knocked off course by the pandemic, and that may make it even harder for him even to keep a sort of steady state in Russia over the next 10 years.
Well, let me ask you another question that just came in. How much of this is Vladimir Putin and how much of this is the Kremlin? And the question would be specifically, when Putin departs the scene, and I'm not sure whether that's in 2024, 2030, or 2036, but when he moves on, would you expect, or should we expect, a leadership that might bring a more modern view, that might say, no, we need to build an economy that produces things that the world wants to buy? It just can't be taking things out of the ground and shipping that overseas.
I mean, I think Putin's done quite a lot to make sure that that doesn't happen in a way. Medvedev probably wasn't the perfect modernizer, but if he had been allowed to keep going, then he might at least have brought about a modest degree of reform in the Russian economy. I'm pretty sure that Putin is. We know that Putin was sort of scarred by the Gorbachev era. I suspect that he will be doing his damnedest to make sure that whoever comes after him is not the next Gorbachev. Not somebody who is actually going to attack the fundamentals of the system, even accidentally. So, incremental rather than revolutionary, I think, would be the best that we can hope for. Now, that's not to say that's the way it will turn out. As you and I both know, history in Russia has a habit of moving by, long periods of the ice being frozen, followed by shorter periods of extremely rapid thaw, followed by the ice resetting in a slightly different configuration. And that may be what we see again. But I'm sort of not anticipating that Putin is going to anoint somebody who is going to seriously damage the Putinist system.
Okay. All right. Could you talk a little bit about Britain's relationship with the Baltic states and how that interplays with Britain's relationship with Moscow?
Yeah, I mean, the relations with the Baltic states are sort of good, but they become a bit insubstantial under Boris Johnson. I mean, David Cameron was very keen on this Nordic Baltic grouping and held a number of so-called Northern Futures Forum summits. And I think Theresa May held one, but obviously she wasn't in office for long enough to make much of it. But with the British military presence in Estonia and long-standing ties to Norway and good relations with Sweden and Finland while we were all members of the EU, the UK has taken quite a close interest in that area, and I think that does help to shape in some ways our attitude to Russia. These are countries with whom we feel quite comfortable talking about strategic issues and European security and defense. And so I think we share to a significant extent their worldview, and certainly in a NATO context, this is the bit of the map that we look at perhaps most closely, because that's the slice that sits facing us.
Okay, well, let me shift a little bit further south and talk a bit about Ukraine and the Russian conflict against Ukraine, which, at least in Washington, I suspect in other Western capitals, they would probably put at the top of the list of problems that burden the West relationship with Russia. You've had now for 5 years, really, the Germans and the French take the lead in trying to broker a solution between Moscow and Kyiv, with not a lot of success in reversing and ending the conflict in Donbass thus far. Would you see a role for Britain and the United States, perhaps under a Biden administration? Are there things that Washington and London might be doing that might increase the chances of moving forward, at least on a resolution of the conflict in Donbass and getting Russian proxy forces out and getting to a point where Ukraine could reestablish sovereignty there?
I mean, it would be nice to think so. I suspect that for probably both of our countries, although not letting things get worse will be a priority, investing enough to make them get better is probably going to be a lower priority. So, I would foresee that the UK will continue to offer, a certain amount of military training and perhaps some equipment to the Ukrainians, that, we'll have a sort of good but rather insubstantial political relationship. But I don't at the moment see the Johnson government saying to the French and Germans, this is an area where we think we can really make a difference. Now, were the Biden administration to name, I don't know, a sort of high-powered special envoy for the negotiations, that might be a different, that might change the picture slightly. But I think at the moment, we're not necessarily completely satisfied with the outcomes that the French and Germans have achieved. But I'm not sure that in London there is anybody clamoring to get involved. You've got to remember that we also sat out the Minsk group when it came to Nagorno-Karabakh. So we have form in not wanting to get too closely involved in the settlement of post-Soviet conflicts.
Okay, and moving a little bit further south, let's talk about Turkey for a moment. You've seen, I think, this rather interesting relationship between Moscow and Ankara over the past 7-8 years between Putin and Erdogan. Obviously, there were some bumps, disagreements over what's going on in Syria, and also the Turkish involvement in the recent conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh between Azerbaijan and Armenia. How does the UK see what's going on between Russia and Turkey? And are there things that perhaps we in the West should be doing to make sure that Erdogan, despite some issues we have with him, still remains firmly anchored in the West?
Yeah. I mean, I think the going in position of the British government is that they want to have a good relationship with Turkey, post-Brexit. We're both going to be countries on the periphery of the EU. Economically, we have had quite close ties. We're both NATO allies, albeit that Turkey at the moment is going through some rather awkward moments in its relationship with NATO and with its neighbours. But I think the British government's sort of general going in point would be, let's try and have a good relationship with Turkey. Let's try to build on that kind of NATO relationship. The non-EU European members of NATO should have some interests in common. I'm not sure that we're in a position to compete with the Russians in some areas. I mean, there is some defence cooperation between the UK and Turkey, but we're not in a position to supply an alternative to S-400, for example. As I indicated before, even when there was a peace process in Nagorno-Karabakh, I mean, a multinational peace process in Nagorno-Karabakh, we chose not to get involved in that. So I'm not sure that we've got sort of good offices to offer to Ankara in that part of the world. It is a very complicated relationship between Ankara and Moscow. The S-400 was a masterstroke in a way from Putin, because it plays to Erdogan's paranoia that the US, if not behind the coup, at any rate, would have been content for the coup to succeed, and that therefore, he wants to have an air defense system that, if his air force turns on him again, can shoot them down without the Americans being able to turn it off. I mean, I'm not saying that this is a sensible or rational way of looking at things, but I think this is the way that he does look at things. So that was a masterstroke. But yeah, you're right. There are some pretty fundamental differences of view between Turkey and Russia over what should happen in the end in Syria, over who should come out on top in Libya. I think Putin would love to be able to detach Turkey from NATO, but I'm not sure that he envisages Turkey being in the Russian camp.
Okay. All right, well, let's turn to the east. How does London look at the relationship that's developed over the last 7 to 10 years between Moscow and Beijing, where it does look like, in a way, Russia sort of turned its back on the West. It's now talks about itself as being not a European country, but a Eurasian country. How concerned should we be about that relationship?
There are certainly some things that we should be concerned about. I think the sort of weapons development cooperation is something that we should watch closely. There are, for all that I was talking about the Russian deficits in the high-tech sector, I mean, the defense high-tech sector is one area where they have done quite a lot. And after a period where they were quite reticent about sharing it with the Chinese, knowing that the Chinese would copy it and sell it more cheaply, the Russians seem to have decided that actually, if you can't beat them, join them. The Chinese are going to do that anyway, so they may as well get something out of the cooperation while they still can. So that's an area where I think we probably do need to watch what's going on, because if you ally Russian technology and Chinese manufacturing capability, and also a rather laissez-faire attitude on the part of the Chinese to who should be allowed to buy weapons, you potentially have something which could be quite threatening to our interests in all sorts of parts of the world. So that's something which I think we would definitely watch. I think we're probably, well, I mean, we can afford to be very relaxed about energy cooperation between Russia and China because we don't buy much of our gas from Russia. Is probably something that, if I were in Germany, I'd be slightly more concerned about. But so far, the Russians have not really got to the point where they can actually divert production from fields in Western Siberia to China. It's still a bloody long way, and somebody's got to pay for the pipelines. And really, I don't think, I mean, the Chinese have been pretty lukewarm about the Altai pipeline going in through Western China. So there will be energy cooperation. Obviously, the Chinese are involved in the Yamal LNG project, which I think is quite interesting for all sorts of reasons, because it says something also about China's Arctic ambitions. But I think I'd probably feel a bit more nervous about that if I were German, but I still wouldn't be panicking about that. And what I don't really see is a sort of mutual defense pact where, the Russians would be able to count on the Chinese turning up to fight their battles in Europe, or the Chinese count on the Russians to help them out in the South China Sea.
Okay. Well, let me squeeze in one last question. You mentioned pipelines, Nord Stream 2. The Russians are making noise like they now believe that they have a way to complete the last 160 kilometers. The US government, of course, is opposed to that. What is the view in Britain, and how do you see that thing playing out?
Yeah, the British view has been to sit on the fence, I think. I mean, there are British energy companies which have some interest in it commercially. I think probably the British government is less worried about it geopolitically than some of the Central Europeans. Again, partly for the selfish reason that, we don't rely on Russian gas anyway. But also, I think because at the end of the day, the gas that travels through Nord Stream 2 is not new gas. It's just, gas that was coming to Europe anyway, but by a different route. And I mean, it could potentially be a problem for Ukraine, maybe for one or two other countries in Central Europe, just because of where the pipelines go. But equally, it wouldn't be beyond the wit of man to find workarounds for most of that. And so, I mean, I think the British government probably rather that Nord Stream 2 had not been conceived, but they're not really looking to strangle it at birth.
Okay, Ian, we've covered a lot of ground. Let me thank you for joining us, and thank you also for the very thoughtful answers. I think you've given us a masterful presentation that tracks in very well with our previous presentations on American and German perspectives. We now have a British view, and let me thank you on behalf of all of our attendees. Were we meeting at Stanford, we would all join in a hearty round of applause, which is something that is difficult to do via Zoom. But thanks again for joining us. We appreciate it.
Well, it's been an enormous pleasure, Steve, and it's always good to see you. And yeah, I mean, as I said on Twitter, my regret is that Zoom doesn't bring me Stanford weather. But I hope in a future upgrade, maybe they can provide that as well.
Well, and let's hope that before too long, we're back to a situation where we can actually begin to do these things in person.
Absolutely. Okay. Good to see you.
Okay. Take care now.